Good morning. Welcome. Delighted that you're all here. Delighted everybody has crossed oceans and battled with the traffic in Singapore to join us this morning. I'm Peter Sluglet. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute, and I'm delighted to open our 5th annual conference on media in the contemporary Middle East. The media's role in political movements has become a prominent topic of recent debate, both in the news and in academia. Social media, microblogging tools, video streaming sites, and mobile phones have gained increasing importance over the last 5 years. Internet connections and mobile applications have emerged as indispensable tools of information acquisition and dissemination. This topic has special relevance in the Arab world, where online and social media have played particularly vital roles over the last 5 years. The aim of our 5th conference is to explore a variety of approaches to media usage in the Arab world, Turkey and Iran. These include online activism, cultural production, and the professional use of media. Among the topics which will be discussed are political blogging and citizen journalism, social media and participation culture, visual and textual cultural production online, as well as gender equality in Arab media. Political bloggers and citizen journalists not only help to connect like-minded people inside the region, but also have played a major role in disseminating news of ongoing events, especially during the Arab uprisings in 2011-12. This conference has been organized by our colleague, Dr. Nella Lenzer, who's been studying this topic for several years. She has a doctorate in Middle East Studies and Media Studies from the University of Oslo and is particularly interested in contemporary literary production online. She's gathered an impressive lineup of practitioners and academics from whom we all hope to learn a great deal today and tomorrow. I'd like to thank her for putting the conference together, and I'd particularly like to thank Huda Al-Junaid, Zubaydah Abdul-Jalil, and the indefatigable Romel Hernando for their sterling work in making all the necessary detailed arrangements to make sure that it all happens. Visual and textual cultural production online is continuously increasing and offers a space to distribute original work without being exposed to limiting social or state-imposed restrictions. YouTube videos, images on Tumblr, the publication of music and poetry in a large variety of forms has gained immense popularity and reaches wide audiences. Gender equality online and offline has been a major topic of discussion during recent protests, and a vast amount of online applications, websites, and social media accounts have been activated in order to spread information on gender-related topics. Another subject of online culture in the region touches on surveillance technology, censorship, and online freedom. While the highly connected uprisings in 2010-12 were met by state oppression and/or curtailment of rights, a close reading of the riots has shown that the new media has also served the state apparatus by facilitating the surveillance of citizens. It has also become an organizational tool for politicking and a platform both for supporting online activism and for creating online activism. In addition, it's vital to look at the ways in which media change is being theorized, as well as keeping the development of online processes in mind. Startups, digital news, and online businesses are all contributing to a fast-growing media scene in the region. This conference aspires to serve as a platform for the exchange of perspective on social movements, on activists, and on cultural production on the one hand, and digital developments, and on theoretical approaches to media developments on the other. Well, now it is my pleasant duty to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Zaha Khamis. Dr. Khamis is associate professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is an expert on Arab and Muslim media and was formerly head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department at Qatar University. She's the co-author of 2 books, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, 2009, and Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, 2013. She has a PhD in Mass Media and Cultural Studies from the University of Manchester at the heart of the empire. Her topic today is cyber activism and the Arab awakening, potentials, limitations, and future prospects.
Good morning, everybody. It's indeed my honor and pleasure to be the keynote speaker in this very important conference, and I would like to very much thank the Middle East Institute in the National University of Singapore for this very kind invitation, and also for the honor of selecting me to be the keynote speaker in this very important contemporary conference. The aim of my presentation this morning is not to bore you to death by telling you things you already know about the Arab Spring, but rather to try to highlight some of the most important potentials of cyber activism, or the process of using new media and social media for the sake of socio-political transformation and change in the region, while at the same time highlighting also some of the limitations and constraints of social media in this regard, and finally, and most importantly, pinpointing some of the future directions that research in this area can take, some of the gaps that we need to fill as researchers, and some of the points we need to address when we talk about this very important phenomena of cyber activism and its potentials and limitations in this region. So basically, 4 years ago in 2011, the Arab world witnessed a sweeping wave of protests and upheavals in a number of countries in what has been described as the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring. We have seen many iconic and symbolic images, historical images spread all over the world. We have seen some of these capitals, like, for example, Cairo, Tahrir Square in Cairo. We have seen some of the capitals in the Arab world really catching international media attention and making the headlines in many of the media platforms and venues. Of course, all of us remember this very important iconic image. Who doesn't? Whenever the Arab Spring is mentioned, that's the image that always comes to our mind. Although there have been many protests and demonstrations in so many other capitals, it's always this very iconic image from the heart of Tahrir Square that comes to our mind whenever we talk about the Arab Spring or the Arab awakening of 2011. So what were the most important characteristics of the Arab Spring? Because part of my presentation will be not just revisiting the role of cyber activism, but even revisiting the whole notion of Arab awakening and Arab Spring, and how we can reformulate or revisit our thinking, not just about cyber activism, but even about the Arab Spring movements themselves. These movements were characterized by being grassroots, bottom-up, across-the-board movements, which included people from different demographic backgrounds and characteristics in terms of age, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, political affiliation, and professional background. They were all united around one call the people want to overthrow the regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. As we all remember these iconic, historic, chants, which really rocked the hearts of these Arab capitals and also made headlines in all over the media internationally as well. So basically we cannot say that it was a rightist movement or a leftist movement or by the Muslim Brotherhood or by the seculars or by the liberals. Everybody was united in this moment of solidarity, uniformity, and equality, calling for the very same things and asking for the very same demand, which is regime change and reform in this important part of the world. So in these popular grassroots movements, protesters started with a peaceful approach, but violence and repression came from the regimes in power. We have seen how the protesters were using peaceful mechanisms in order to enact change and socio-political transformation and call for the regime change in their own countries. But in many cases, unfortunately, many of these movements were met by violence and repression from the regimes in power. And we have seen images of, many of these young protesters being sprayed, if not, harassed or beaten up or even killed in some severe instances by the regimes in power and their own police and military apparatus. Authoritarian regimes controlled the mass media, but protesters found ways to spread information and news and calls to action using social media. And I always like to use this particular iconic image because I think it is very telling in itself. If you look here, you will see this Egyptian protester who is holding this sign or this banner that spells out the word Egypt. And if you look closely, you will see that every one of the letters on this banner stands for a symbol that has to do with social media or new media, right? The E for Internet Explorer, G for Google, Y for Yahoo, P for PayPal, and T for Twitter. So basically, he is telling us here by just raising this banner how important and how central the role of social media and new media was in terms of enacting the needed change and transformation in the Arab Spring in general and in the Egyptian Revolution in particular. And as we always say in journalism and communication, one word equals one photo or one picture equals 1,000 words, right? So you can always have one picture only that's so iconic and powerful that can equal 1,000 words. There were also young people like these people, Wael Ghunaim and Abdurrahman Mansour, who created the very famous iconic Facebook page known as We Are All Khalid Saeed, which I myself wrote about and other authors have written about because of its very important, central and iconic role in enacting change and transformation in the Egyptian Revolution. Of course, as we all know, this young man, Khalid Saeed, was dragged out of an internet cafe in the city of Alexandria, and he was beaten to death simply because he was brave enough to upload a video on YouTube which exposed the police, corruption in Egypt. They were trying to spread or to divide the benefits from a drug raid among themselves, and he uploaded this video, and for that he paid his life as a price for this particular form of cyber activism. So this page, Where All Khalid Saeed, became a very iconic Facebook page around which people rallied and united. And the claim was, we will not allow this kind of police brutality to take over our lives, and we're going to resist this form of police brutality and this form of repression. So basically, the process of using social media and new media in the realm of socio-political transformation has been referred to as cyber activism, which some authors like Philip Howard defined as using new media and social media to advance a cause which is difficult to advance offline. That's how cyber activism has been commonly defined. There were multiple roles of new media and social media in the Arab Spring, catalysts that paved the way for a democratic transition. They were also amplifiers for the calls for reform. They were also platforms for self-expression. They were channels for communication, networking, and organization, bridge builders between the young activists and their own followers on the ground, or between the virtual world and the real world, avenues for civic engagement and popular participation. They became from safety valves to mobilization tools and arenas for a new form of citizen journalism. I'd like to particularly focus on the last 2 points, which is the shift from being safety valves to mobilization tools. For a long time, we have witnessed a very perplexing, paradoxical phenomena in the Arab world where we have seen a limited margin of opposition voices allowed in the media arena, which did not actually translate into real change or real transformation on the ground. In other words, some of the regimes in power would allow a very limited, small margin of opposition voices here and there as a way for people to vent their anger and frustration in what has been described as the safety valve phenomena. In other words, instead of having people explode, which is eventually what happened, of course, we just leave a certain margin for them to vent their anger and frustration. This has been referred to as the safety valve paradox in describing Arab media, and for a long time, that has been the case. There will be voices of protest, voices of opposition, which did not translate into actual socio-political transformation or regime change until we have seen this change in the 2011 Arab Spring movement, and we have seen this safety valve paradox turn into actual change and actual mobilization on the ground. Also, arenas for civic engagement and for citizen journalism, providing platforms for the activists and protesters to use social media and new media to make their own voices heard, locally, regionally, as well as globally and internationally. I want to pinpoint here a very important point. Sometimes when people talk about new media and social media in the Arab Spring, they tend to lump all of the social media together under one category and talk about them uniformly, as if they all did the same thing or played the very same role. I want to argue that each one of these social media actually had its own strengths and its own advantages in terms of the role which it actually played in the arena of cyber activism. For example, Facebook was the best tool for networking and for mobilization, just like we talked before about the Facebook page where Awal Khalid Saeed, these two young people created the page, and then a lot of people started to rally and network around it. You invite people to like your page, and these people start to invite other people, and you have what is called the ripple effect or the snowball effect, where the ball starts to roll and more people start to network, and they start to be attracted to this particular cause. Twitter was the best for on-the-ground organization and coordination, minute-by-minute organization on the ground. For example, we have seen this book that came out online, which is called Tweets from Tahrir. And this particular book was very interesting because the protesters and demonstrators in the heart of Tahrir Square were actually documenting everything that was happening to them minute by minute. Like, I am being sprayed right now. I'm being attacked. I'm being, harassed by the police. Please send help on the way. Don't go to this particular street because it's blocked. Take another street, and so on. So that's why it was very effective, Twitter, for on-the-ground, minute-by-minute organization and coordination. Blogs were the best for brainstorming and for exchanging views. Myself and my co-author, Muhammad Nawawi, wrote this book, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, which dealt specifically with the process of political blogging and how it paved the way for change and for transformation in the case of the Egyptian Revolution. So blogs are a way to enable people to engage, to discuss, to brainstorm, and to exchange views around important issues. And YouTube, of course, was the best avenue for recording visual images and documentation. So whenever you really wanted to document a certain process that's going on the ground and let people know about it, you use YouTube for this purpose. And I should mention here that if it was not for YouTube, we would have no clue what was going on inside a country like Syria, because the government really banned a lot of foreign correspondents, journalists from entering the country, and if it was not for YouTube, we would have no clue about the massacres and the massive humanitarian crisis and disaster which is going on inside a country like Syria. However, having talked about all of these great potentials, right, of social media and new media, and the process of cyber activism in the Arab Spring, I'd like to move to the next point, which is the limitations and the constraints of these social media venues, or what they cannot really achieve in the realm of socio-political transformation. We have to bear in mind that social media are important tools for aiding political change, since they can act as catalysts that can complement the process of political transition and speed it up. In other words, when you look at these social media tools, it is best to look at them as catalysts that can speed up the process of socio-political transformation and political change. However, they are not magical tools, and they cannot bring political change all by themselves. It is always the people on the ground who can bring about the needed transition and enact change. That's a very important point, and I'll talk more about it later on when we talk about the future prospects in looking at the role of social media and cyber activism in this part of the world, because we all, including myself, as academics, as scholars, as writers, had this moment of euphoria. We were very euphoric. We were very excited about the changes happening in this part of the world, this region, but also about the role of social media and cyber activism. And I remember giving a talk about this particular topic at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I remember the moderator saying, "Dr. Khamis, don't you think you're a little bit upbeat?" 4 years later, I think I was. But of course, I'm an Egyptian citizen myself, and I had this very a lot of hopes and excitement and enthusiasm about socio-political change in this region, as well as about the role of social media in the process as well. So I cannot claim to be detached. I have my own subjectivity as well. So we really need to rethink about two very important things. To rethink about the Arab Spring movements, the nature of these movements themselves, as well as rethink and revisit the role of social media or cyber activism in the process of socio-political transformation in the region. And for that, I will devote the rest of my presentation. First of all, rethinking the Arab Spring movements themselves. How can we, 4 years later, after the euphoria, between quotation marks, how can we rethink these Arab Spring movements? Look at them in a different way or in a different light. First of all, we cannot talk about the Arab Spring movements or the Arab Awakening movements as one single category and just lump all of the different countries in one particular category and say the Arab Spring movements, the Arab Spring Awakening. Why? Because we had different outcomes in different countries. So it's very, very important to make a distinction between the outcomes in these different nations or these different countries. 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring movements, it became obvious that the path to democratization and socio-political transformation in many of the post-Arab Spring countries is far from smooth or straightforward, right? So now we are seeing that the outcome of many of these so-called Arab Awakening movements or Arab Spring movements is not really a very paved or smooth path as we had initially anticipated or hoped for. Syria is suffering from a brutal civil war and an enormous humanitarian crisis. It's unprecedented, it is enormous. Egypt relapsed back into a military dictatorship after having a democratically elected president for 1 year only. We are now seeing a backlash in the democratic process. Libya is in a state of total chaos and became a stateless state without really institutions or mechanisms of control. There is a lot of strife and a lot of sectarian violence inside the country. Yemen has internal rifts and tensions in addition to, of course, being subject to military attacks, leaving the country in a state of mess. Bahrain is so-called the forgotten revolution, which no one really talks about much, although there has been a very strong resistance movement to the regime in Bahrain, but for many reasons, there has been also an interest in shutting up the protests and keeping them as away from the media spotlight as possible. And that's why there was this documentary called Shouting in the Dark, which talks about the uprisings in Bahrain and how they have been silenced, calling them or naming them, quote unquote, the forgotten revolution, which is not talked about much or not discussed much in the media. So as you can see here, just looking at these countries, this is not a smooth path to democratization or socio-political reform. In fact, it's a very bumpy and rocky path. And we cannot talk about all of these countries as one category. We have to look very carefully and investigate the differences and the distinctions between these countries as individual, unique cases, which had different outcomes and different results. Of course, we all have this visual map, how it started, where it started, the different countries that have undergone this process of Arab Awakening or Arab Spring movements, starting in Tunisia, moving on to Egypt, Libya, then Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. So we know the sequence and we know the geographic location of these countries. We just have to bear in mind the different path and the different outcomes and results that came out of each one of these countries. So not all countries have the same political, economic, or social conditions, and therefore the pace and the direction of change is different in each country's case. In Tunisia, which is the only country which appears to have a relatively smooth transition, there was no active civil society before the revolution, no press freedom, and the regime was taken by surprise. The social media caused what can be described as a cascade effect. In other words, it's a very interesting statement. The people started to feel that I knew that my neighbor knew that I knew, What does that mean? It means that people thought that they are in isolated islands. Everyone is angry, upset with the regime, is not happy with the regime, but I'm not sure if my sentiments are also shared by my neighbors or not. Do my neighbors have the same feeling? Do they have the same sentiment or not? So by having this kind of outburst in in media images. We all know what happened, of course, in the city of Sidi Bouzaid when the young, fruit vendor Mohammed Bouazizi lit himself up on fire, which came to be symbolically and metaphorically described as the fire that lit up the flames of the entire Arab Spring movement or Arab Spring awakening. And before that, we did not really see these iconic images break out in the media, right? People were protesting, they were demonstrating. Don't make a mistake thinking that all of a sudden people became angry in 2011. There have been many, many instances of demonstration and protest and rebellion against the regimes, but we have not seen it on this massive scale that we have witnessed in 2011, and thanks to social media, it amplified the messages and brought out the messages internationally and globally through citizen journalism. So when these images broke out in Tunisia, people were like, what's going on in Tunisia? Right, this small, relatively calm, modernized, right, country in North Africa, people did not think of it as a hub for people's anger, resentment, and protest until they saw these very powerful, iconic images break out in the media. But the regime was taken by surprise. They had no clue. They did not anticipate this to happen, did not expect it to take place, and therefore they were completely taken by surprise. They were clueless and did not know how to react to this kind of massive wave of protest. In Egypt, there was a relatively more active civil society before the revolution compared to Tunisia. If we compare Egypt to Tunisia, there was a relatively more active civil society in the Egyptian case. For example, we had movements previously, like the April 6 movement, and the Kifaya movement. The word Kifaya in Arabic means enough. So they were trying to send a very clear message to the Egyptian president saying enough is enough. Obviously, he did not get the message until it was really too late. However, the regime was also unprepared and taken by surprise. It was not as media or technologically savvy as the protesters and the political activists. Therefore, the regime used ineffective and even counterproductive mechanisms, such as pulling down the kill switch and halting internet access and cell phones. And that's a very important point. When we compare the strategies used by the activists and the protesters vis-a-vis the techniques used by the regimes in power, we can see a big gap. The activists and protesters are being more technologically savvy. Young people, highly educated, are well in control of the tools of using social media, very technologically savvy, and able to use things like even speak-to-tweet service. I don't know how many of you know about it, but when the regime in Egypt pulled down the kill switch and completely disconnected the internet for a whole week, which was of course a very counterproductive and very ineffective thing to do, the protesters did not just do nothing. They actually use a service called Speak to Tweet. You can just call Twitter and you can feed your message verbally over the phone, and the message will then appear on the internet even if you don't really have online access or internet access, which is very, very interesting. So they became very creative in using these alternative venues and platforms to kind of really get around the government blockages of the internet and to really convey their own message against all odds. In Syria, there was maximum repression and brutality from the regime, no active civil society or press freedom. However, the regime was more prepared and was not taken by surprise when the protests erupted, because it learned from the cases of Tunisia and Egypt. It became more technologically savvy. For example, the Syrian regime created what is called the Syrian Electronic Army, which is really an army, so to speak, of hackers who are working for the regime in power, trying to trace the different media platforms and social media platforms of these protesters and activists, and trying to block them, hack them, or simply in some cases even trace the IP addresses of these activists, and in some severe cases even arrest them and put them in jail or even have them killed. So it was a very, very strong, very effective form of trying to combat protest online, and that shows a very important point. This means that the regimes in power also built their own learning curves and sharpened their own tools, not just the activists. That's a very important point to remember. Because whenever we talk about cyber activism in the region, we always talk about the protesters, the activists. They use social media. They use cyber activism. What about the regimes? right? The regimes in power, they also built their own learning curve. They also sharpened their own tools. They also learned their own lessons, right? So we cannot say that the Syrian regime was acting in a way that's similar to the Egyptian or the Tunisian regime, because it looked at the experiences of Egypt and Tunisia and learned from them, and therefore sharpened its own tools and its own mechanisms of resistance in a clear learning curve. Another point about readdressing or revisiting the Arab Spring movements or the Arab Awakening movements and rethinking these movements, besides, of course, looking at the different outcomes in different countries, not treating them as one category, but as unique individual cases, and also looking at the learning curve of the regimes in power, is readdressing or revisiting the notion of leaderless revolution. I'm sure many of us heard this term, leaderless revolutions, leaderless revolutions. I would like to take this with a grain of salt and to really readdress this particular point. The term leaderless revolution has been used a lot to describe the Arab Spring movements. However, there is a need to reconsider this particular term, as there is evidence now that there has been a form of bottom-up, semi-structured, grassroots leadership, which is not imposed from above by one or few charismatic leaders. In other words, we cannot say it's completely leaderless. There was some form or some type of leadership. However, it was not a top-down imposed leadership in the hands of a few charismatic leaders, one or few charismatic leaders. Rather, it was really much more of a bottom-up, grassroots, across-the-board form of leadership by a group of people who became inspired and became active in the arena of cyber activism and socio-political transformation. This was, however, a double-edged sword. In a way, having this kind of semi-structured, bottom-up, grassroots form of leadership made it harder for the regime to just pinpoint a handful of activists and put them in jail, which has been the case in prior attempts to topple the regimes in many of the Arab Spring countries. On the other hand, however, there was a vacuum in power. What does that mean? There were not well-entrenched organizations or institutions of civil society, as we have seen after that in many of the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, a vacuum in civil society. No clear, structured opposition parties or opposition movements that can really stand up to the regimes in power and enact socio-political transformation and smooth transition to change after the eruption of the Arab Spring. As the saying goes, it's easy to oust a dictator from office, but it's hard to decide what to do next, right? So you can say, go Mubarak, irhal, Mubarak must go, and he goes, and he leaves office. But then what comes next? If you're not prepared with civil society institutions and organizations and opposition movements, you will have a power vacuum, and you might even have a backlash or relapse back into a state of chaos or a state of dictatorship, which has been unfortunately the case in many of the so-called post-Arab Spring countries, including Egypt. That's why we need to also revisit the role of the process of civic engagement, the role of having or not having an active civil society, organized opposition movements, and structured institutions and mechanisms in place. This absence of civil society, coupled with semi-structured loose leadership, led to creating a power vacuum, which contributed to the democratic setbacks and current grievances in many of the so-called, quote-unquote, post-Arab Spring countries. We don't have these well-entrenched institutions or mechanisms or parties in place, and therefore you have a vacuum, and this vacuum can be filled by chaos or by different parties having conflicting interests, and therefore it can create further polarization, fragmentation, division, and even chaos inside these countries. So that has been some of the points I wanted to highlight about revisiting or rethinking the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening movements 4 years later. And also, and that's the last part of my presentation, revisiting the role of the process of cyber activism and the use of social media and new media. What can be the future prospects that we as researchers and scholars studying this very important topic or this very important issue should look at? What should we explore or look at or examine moving forward in terms of the process of cyber activism and the role that social media and new media played in these movements? First of all, unpacking the double role of social media. If there is a moment of unity and uniformity motivated by common goals, for example, the Egyptian revolution of 2011, then social media can be very successful in increasing this unity and amplifying the voices of protest. It can also help in acting as a catalyst and a mobilizer, as well as a networking tool. When people have one common goal, all of us, Muslims, Christians, liberals, Islamists, women, men, rich, poor, have the same demand, which is irhal, Mubarak must go, right? Or الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. People want to topple the regime. Then it becomes very effective to use social media. Why? Because all of us are going to use social media and new media to amplify this particular message, to spread the message, to make it louder, to make it clearer. And we're all going to make maximum impact using social media and new media in this regard. However, and that's a very important point, once we have deep divisions and fragmentations, as we are seeing now in many of the post-Arab Spring countries, including Egypt, then social media can widen the gap between different groups and increase the tensions and the divisions between them. In other words, once we start to have fragmentation and division and polarization, then every one of us is going to use social media and new media as a weapon against the other. So you're going to use your Facebook page to attack your opponents are going to use their Twitter account to slander you, and it keeps going on and on and on. And I want to pinpoint the word that polarization is different from plurality. Plurality is a good thing. It's good to have pluralistic or different viewpoints. Every one of us has a different viewpoint, different opinion. That's a good thing. Polarization, however, means that you are going to two extreme bipolar opposites. None of us is tolerant of the other person's view. Every one of us thinks that he or she is only the right person or the right group, and you start to label or stigmatize or slander even your own opponents and those who stand on the other end of the spectrum. And that's exactly what's happening now in many of the so-called post-Arab Spring countries, including Egypt, where you see very, very limited acceptance of the other, very limited dialogue. There's a lot of polarization, a lot of fragmentation and division. And when you have this situation, then social media will become a tool for division. Rather than for unity, it will become a tool for increasing the divisions rather than creating solidarity. And that's a very important point to remember. We can call this the double-edged role, or the double role of social media and new media. Also, we have to reconsider and rethink the urban-centric elitist focus of many of the research that has been done on the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening movement so far. Many of these movements took place in the capitals, right? And most of the previous research on the role of social media in the Arab Spring focused on urban areas, especially capitals and big cities. It also focused on the elitist upper middle class educated activists who are technologically savvy. More research has to be conducted on rural areas and small towns, as well as on average citizens. We also have to pay special attention, especially important to look at the process of digital divide and the infrastructural barriers and constraints to the process of the use of social media and new media in the Arab world. In other words, as you have seen at the very beginning of my presentation, this iconic image came from Tahrir Square, where? In Cairo, right? The capital of Egypt. And the same could be said about the other Arab Spring countries, where you have always seen the attention, whether of researchers and scholars or of the media, focusing on the main cities, the big capitals. What about these small towns? The rural areas, were they completely dormant, totally sleeping? They did not play any role? Of course not. We know for sure that many of these small towns and even small villages had their own form of protest or demonstration or activism. And in the case of Egypt, there are a lot of supporters of the deposed president, Mohammed Morsi, in the small villages and the small towns. Of course, he belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood does have a large base of sympathizers in Egypt because they always offered a very active role in terms of providing, social services, economic services, subsidized goods and commodities, and so on and so forth, free medical treatment. And in a country that has a high poverty rate, these kinds of activities will gain you popularity. So they did have a very popular base of support where in some of the small towns and some of the villages. So now we as researchers of the media have to start to pay attention to what can be described as the ruralization of protest. Look at the rural areas. Look outside of the urban-centric focus. Look outside of the elitist, upper middle class, angle, and try to really widen your perspective as a researcher to look at what's happening in the smaller towns, what's happening in the villages, in rural areas, and what's happening with people who are not so technologically savvy, and they have what is called the digital divide, the divide between the technologically haves and have-nots. And we cannot ignore in this regard the infrastructural and economic and technological barriers in many of the Arab countries, many of which are suffering from infrastructural, technical, and economic barriers that can really limit the use and the effectiveness of social media. That needs to be addressed more. Also, we need to revisit the role of citizen journalism. Citizen journalists played a very vital role in the Arab Spring movements. They paved the way for the revolutions, for example, the political bloggers in the case of Egypt and also in the case of Tunisia. They also played an important role in three important things: mobilization, documentation, and education. Mobilization, helping to get people together, to rally together, to create some form of snowballing effect, some form of impact on the socio-political path. But at the same time, documentation, as we saw in the case of Syria, right? If it was not for citizen journalists, you will not know about the massacres happening inside Syria. And education, by raising awareness nationally and internationally, regionally and globally about what is needed in these countries, why we have to have socio-political transformation, and why change is most needed in these countries. And they influence the agenda of mainstream media. Very important points. Not just in the political arena, but even in the social arena. We have seen some of the political bloggers in some of these countries break the taboos. Not just in the political arena by talking about things like corruption, governmental corruption, and violations of human rights by the regimes in power, but even in the social arena. Things like, for example, talking about sexual harassment on the streets of Cairo. Some of these political bloggers, for the very first time, started to break the taboo in the political arena as well as in the social arena, and by doing that, they imposed this new agenda on mainstream media. In other words, mainstream media had to catch up with these, cyber activists and these young bloggers by starting to talk about issues that were previously a taboo, whether in the political domain or even in the social domain. And their role has to be revisited 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring. Now, we as scholars and researchers on the media have to start to revisit this role of citizen journalism and ask ourselves, what role are these citizen journalists playing now, 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring movements, right? Are they having positive effects, negative effects, both negative and positive, and in what ways? Also, for further investigating cyber wars, taking into account that both regimes and their opponents use cyber activism, we have to further study the process of cyber wars, or the tug of war between both parties. How are these cyber wars different now than they were 4 years ago? What forms are they taking, and what tools are being used by both the activists as well as the regimes in power? How are they different in different countries, right? So this phenomena of cyber war, the tug of war between the regime on one hand and the protesters on the other hand, and we talked about the learning curve, right? How is that different 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring? How can we revisit this process of cyber war, and how can we look at it differently based on which country and which case are we specifically looking at? Further examination of the role of activists in the diaspora. Activists in the diaspora played a very important role in instigating the Arab Spring movements in their own countries by paving the road for them, using awareness, raising awareness through their own role as citizen journalists, and also helping in mobilization and networking, as well as material and moral support. For example, the active role of the Syrian opposition movement in the diaspora, exchanging useful knowledge and advice between Tunisian and Egyptian activists and protesters. So many of the activists or the protesters who were in the diaspora, opposition leaders in the diaspora, played a very important role in enacting the process of socio-political transformation and change in these Arab Spring countries. They started to spread technical know-how, information, knowledge, support, moral support, technical support, material support. We need to pay more attention as researchers of the media to the role of these activists in the diaspora and what kind of effect or impact they had and are having on the process of socio-political change and transformation in this important region. Reinvestigating cyber feminism, and that's a very important topic I've been writing about myself and very passionate about it. And women alongside youth played a very, very important role, central role and visible role in the Arab Spring movements. For example, we all know about Tawakkul Karman, who became known as the mother of the revolution in Yemen, and we know about her winning the Nobel Prize, being the first Arab woman to win the Nobel Prize in what could be described as a nod for the Arab Spring movements in general, but also a nod for the role of women in the Arab Spring movements in particular. Many other Arab women also became iconic figures of resistance, activism, and protest. Their roles 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring and beyond has to be closely reinvestigated and reassessed. We have to pay more attention to the role of women in this process of cyber activism, or we should call it even cyber feminism, as some of the literature refers to it, using social media and new media as a tool to enact change, not just politically, but also socially, and to advance the causes of women and the rights of women in this part of the world. And we had many iconic figures. This is Nawara Nigm, a prominent blogger who used her own blog and Twitter accounts. She had hundreds of thousands of followers, and she tried to enact change through her own powerful messages on her blog, as well as in Twitter. And she was one of the 5 bloggers covered in my book, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, because of her very active and visible role as a blogger and a cyber activist. Also, this young woman, Asma Mahfouz, who became another iconic figure of the Arab Spring movement because of her very, very powerful vlog. We all know this kind of terminology. Vlog means when you are blogging using video, this is called a vlog. So she had this very iconic vlog on YouTube. I advise you to look at it or to watch it if you did not do so already. It was very powerful, and she was really trying to change the gender stereotype and to call on young women to go out to the street and to call on men not to criticize women for their activism, but rather to go out and to join the women in the process and to even protect them. She said, you know, don't just criticize women and say, women have no business being out there protesting. Be a man, go out in the street, protest yourself, and also at the same time protect the women who are protesting. So she was playing on the gender stereotype and gender roles in a very effective way. I advise you and recommend that you actually watch her vlog. It's very effective and very powerful. Avoiding technological determinism, and that's my last point, moving away from the initial euphoria of hailing the role of cyber activism in the Arab Spring by talking about things like Egypt's Facebook revolution, Tunisia's Twitter uprising, or Syria's YouTube uprising. We have seen some of these terms floating around, very often: Facebook revolution, Twitter uprising, YouTube uprising. These terms have to be revisited and reconsidered again. Becoming more aware of the limitations of social media and new media and the process of cyber activism in these movements, and being aware of the dangers of clicktivism or slacktivism, which means replacing words for actions. That's very important, because some people think that if I share a link, right, I send you a link, I have done my part, now I'm an activist. It takes much more than that, obviously, right? That's why there was a group formed in Egypt, and we all know how Egyptians have a great sense of humor. After the Egyptian revolution erupted, they created this group called "Clicking on the Mouse Behind Your Computer Screen Will Not Change the World." It's a very long name for a group, but it's also very telling and very effective, right? If you just click on the mouse behind the screen, you did not really change the world, did you? Right? You think that you did, which is called the process of slacktivism or clicktivism, but in reality you are replacing words for actions. So in reassessing social media's future role in the Arab world, it would be wise to adopt the middle ground of cautionary optimism or cyber realism, which avoids the two undesirable bipolar extremes of cyber pessimism or cyber optimism, which tend to either underestimate or overestimate the role of social media in the process of socio-political transformation. In other words, cyber optimism is like the social media and new media is the end all, be all. Once you use them, you're gonna enact socio-political change. Obviously, we know 4 years later this is not the case. Cyber pessimism is trying to underplay the role of these social media and to say, they're just tools. They're not gonna create any kind of impact. They're not even important to study. We need the middle ground of cyber realism, which reassesses the role of social media and new media and puts it in the right perspective and the right context without exaggeration, overestimation, or underestimation. As previously mentioned, social media are just tools for change, but they're not magical tools and they cannot create the change all by themselves. It's always the people on the ground who can always make the change happen if and when they decide to do so. In other words, if they decide to actually pay the price of change, and they decide to go out in the street and protest and face the bullets with their own, bare chest, then change can actually happen. So a final word, in looking ahead, it would be very wise to adopt a balanced and realistic approach in predicting the Arab region's political future in the midst of the ongoing current socio-political transformations. This middle ground, this balanced approach should acknowledge the valuable gains and victories which have been achieved so far, while at the same time taking into account the serious current limitations and challenges and threats that are lying ahead. Likewise, it's equally important to adopt a similarly balanced and realistic approach in reassessing the role of social media and new media and the transformative Arab media landscape with all its current challenges and changes. In other words, we don't want to go to the extreme of being overly optimistic, everything is rosy and flowery, we're going to have a smooth path. Obviously, this is not the case, but we don't also want to create a doomsday scenario where everything is very bleak and very gloomy. We need to have the middle ground of realistic assessment of what's going on in the region, acknowledge the positive changes that happen, but at the same time be very open-eyed in terms of the real challenges and changes going on and the threats that are really facing this region as well. The key question now is, how can we return back to constructive dialogue and democratization to build a better future for this important region, the Arab world? And how can media, especially social media and new media, help us to achieve this goal? And with this, I would like to end my keynote speech. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Here in Singapore.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Khamis.
Thank you.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is perhaps, in my opinion, the pioneers of cyber activism in the Arab world, I would argue, are jihadi groups from Iraq, the various jihadi groups that emerged in Iraq after 2003. I think they were the first to really take to YouTube after 2005 and Facebook in 2006 and Twitter and so forth. And they have been considerably more adept and have been considerably more successful at it. And I think that's one thing that's worth looking at, is why have they been so much more successful? The question is, I'd like to hear your views as to the mass protests that are happening in Iraq and Lebanon today. Do they differ in substantial ways from the wave of protests in 2011, or are they destined to have the same tragic consequences? Thank you.
I think you asked two different questions, right? The first one is about the role of jihadi groups, and I think I want to thank you for raising this particular point, because indeed there is a lot of, activism, I should say, in this realm of radicalization, unfortunately, and many of these radical groups are surprisingly very technologically savvy. I was invited one time to one panel that had to do with the role of ISIS and their own recruitment mechanisms and techniques that are being used. And I was very surprised to see some of the videos. They actually produced YouTube videos that were very effective. And I was like, wow. They use music and, and audio visuals and very touching, very kind of emotional appeals to the young people, right? And I think that we have to consider the activity of some of these groups, the radical groups or the extremist groups. What kind of tools are they using, and how is that affecting also the landscape in this region 40 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring? So I would add this point also to the list of future prospects and future themes that need to be looked at and addressed. I do not favor, however, the overestimation of the power of these groups, because they remain to be a fringe, a very, very small fringe. It's a unfortunately loud fringe, right? And the media focuses on them. Sometimes it over-focuses on them. Too much attention to them in the media. I argue we should have a balanced approach. We should not, turn a blind eye to these groups, because obviously if they are online, they can have an impact on some young people and they can influence them and recruit them, which is a very dangerous phenomena. But I do not favor the idea of overestimating their power and focusing too much on them, even in our scholarly and academic research. Because unfortunately, after 9/11, whenever you mention the word Arab world or Islamic world and you write about it, most of what has been written has been focusing on these kind of extremist radical groups and talking about things like terrorism online and radical groups online, and that has been really the key focus of a lot of the research coming out of this region, which I don't think is also a good approach. We should balance this with What are the 1.6 billion Muslims all over the world writing about? What are they talking about? Which is why myself and my co-author Muhammad Nawawi wrote the first book, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, because we wanted to create some kind of balance. There are average Muslims out there who talk about things like cooking and dating, and what can I do if I marry a guy from a different culture, right? And how should I deal with my neighbors who are non-Muslims? Should I go and visit them in Christmas? Is it okay to give them a Christmas gift? These are issues that people talk about day in and day out, but they don't get enough attention, whether in the media or whether in our own scholarship and our own writings as scholars, and that's something we need to address. And for the second part of your question, I think there's a lot going on in the region right now. The whole, landscape is changing, politically, socially, communication-wise. We cannot really, it's a little bit premature to tell the course of action that these types of protests that you mentioned are going to take and what kind of effect or outcome they're going to have, because we have to again look at the uniqueness and individuality of each one of these countries and the set of socioeconomic political conditions within this particular country at a particular moment in time. We cannot really generalize, come up with a sweeping generalization as to whether they will be similar or different. I think we will need time in order to tell. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm definitely from the United States Naval Academy. You raised this perfect dichotomy that I want to press you on, and that is the difference between activist approach versus a more passive approach. And one of the things I struggle with in my research is how do I take all of those micro changes, those everyday life, those searching online for recipes or answers to all the Ask the Imam questions. There are two main categories, food and sex. Okay, so if you're not an activist, but you use the technology in your everyday life, and the impact of using the technologies in a more passive sense can be sweeping and sustainable change. But how do we study that?
I would not really use the words, passive and active, if I may just, disagree with you on this particular point. I think that people who raise issues like, cooking and recipe and dating, and is it okay for a Muslim woman to marry a non-Muslim guy? And, there's this post that I talked about in the book, Islam.com. A woman posted on one of these websites, I fell in love with a non-Muslim guy, help! That was the title of the post. And it's like that in the book as well. It was very interesting, right? Because she raised this issue, and what can I do now? And should I go ahead and marry him, or not? Or should I stay away from him and just break up the relationship? These are real issues that people talk about. I do not think this is a form of passive use of the media. I think it's still a very active form of using the media. It's not just using it for the purpose of quote-unquote cyber activism, as we talked about it today, enacting socio-political transformation and change using social media. But, as you rightly pointed out, we cannot turn a blind eye to these many important posts that are being, on social media day in and day out in many, many different areas of everyday life. I don't think this is a passive use of the media. I think it's a different use of the media. And that's why we as scholars of communication should also look at these phenomena and address them and talk about the use of social media for these everyday interactions, right, that are very much part of people's lives, right? Okay. Thank you.
As an Egyptian lady, my name is Fatma Galal. As an Egyptian lady, I'm very proud to see such a scholar.
Oh, thank you.
You
made my day.
Yes, and evidently you are a media scholar.
Thank you so much.
But I just want to draw your attention to one thing. There is no such thing as a democratically elected military dictatorship. Thank you. This is just a comment.
No, I did not say that. I said you miss. I think you did not get my point.
It was very evident. It said
no. I said
dictatorship. Yeah.
I said that there was a democratically elected president for 1 year in Egypt, and was overthrown by a military dictatorship.
No,
that's what I said.
It was not overthrown by a military dictatorship. There was a public uprising, and then there was another democratically elected president.
So let me just...
It's just a comment.
Yeah,
okay, we're not going to...
No, it's okay, yeah.
Thank you.
You are right, in a sense that I should... No, let me just say something. I should have said the following. I should have said the following, which I actually used in other presentation. Thank you, Ms. Fatma. Thank you. I did say in other presentations, I did not include it today, but I should have said the following. That this democratically elected president has been overthrown in what has been described by some as a military coup, by others as a popular uprising, and by a third group as a military coup which is supported by a popular uprising among the people. So there are three. You are right. She has a good point. She has a good point. And she started out by telling me some nice words, so I'm going to take your comments. You are right, and I should have included this, and I did include this actually in my other presentations talking about this particular topic, that there are, thank you, there are three different ways to look at it, and we cannot all share the same worldview, but thank you.
Okay, Anthony.
Yeah, my name is Anthony Teo. I'm a founder director in MEI. I like your speech, and just a comment on this. Maybe it was constitutional democracy that Nasser started in Egypt, in that context. But my question is, whereas we may not overtly rely on social media in action, in a comparative way, in the United Kingdom elections, in social media, the Scottish were very adept at it.
We're very
Good at it. And they won 56 out of 59 seats. Okay? But overall in England, with 35 million voters, it was more indeterminate. So there was a lot of talk that there would be a hung parliament. Okay? Except there was a blogger who said that in looking at the interpretation of how people would vote and how people would feel, in England, in the United Kingdom, conservatives are very bad reporters to polls. They do not tell the truth. In any event, the outcome was a landslide victory for the conservatives. Okay? And in this case, everybody was wrong. The media was wrong, the new media was wrong, except the blogger, and the betting shops were also wrong. So in this case, two things happened. One case in the north, in Scotland, where new media and social media was very effective. But in the overall United Kingdom scene, it was more indeterminate. So there are other social, anthropological issues.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's why we have to look at every single case as a unique case in itself, right? We cannot come up with this, sweeping generalizations, right? Which is what happened in the moment of euphoria. Scholars, including myself, I now revisit my own scholarship. I look at it in a different light, just like the lady who told me in the Woodrow Wilson Center, Dr. Khamis, don't you think you're a little bit upbeat? And at that moment I was like, no, I'm a proud Egyptian and this is happening and Egyptians are making history and the world will never go back again. It was a very, very euphoric moment, right? And we cannot, as I said, separate ourselves from our own subjectivity. I'm an ethnographer, a qualitative researcher, so I very much value the role of subjectivity, but we should also keep our own subjectivity in check. And we should avoid coming up with these sweeping generalizations about how social media and new media is going to change the landscape. As you rightly mentioned at the end of your comment, we should look at these different sociological, anthropological, political, and social factors. And if we fail to do so, we are not going to give a very accurate depiction or analysis of reality. Thank you.
Okay, please. And then...
Hello, Mohammed Sanan from ICPBTR, RSIS.
Thank you.
So thank you for your speech. I just wanted to, your comments on what role did the expatriate population of Egypt and Yemen play? Because I believe there's a very large population of them available, who work and reside in the GCC countries and mainly the GCC countries. So considering that the GCC countries are a little bit more stricter with their laws, I believe, in terms
more
of...
what? Excuse me?
Stricter, I'd say.
Strict, oh.
Yeah, right. So, what role, what was the dynamism or the dynamics of this population outside Egypt and the Arab countries, the Arab Spring countries? Any comments on it?
In general, we can say that many of these, diasporic protesters or opposition leaders, right, they played a very important role in terms of a number of things. In terms of spreading the technological know-how. For example, in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, it's very, very interesting to see some of the dynamics that were going on online between some of the Tunisian activists and protesters and their Egyptian counterparts. They were trying to pass on their own knowledge, their own experiences, their own, day-to-day interactions with the police and the military to the Egyptian protesters. It was very interesting. So they would say things like, and that's in the book Egyptian Revolution 2.0, they would say things like, make sure you have water with you. If you are a girl, you can put onions under your scarf. I'm not very excited about the idea of putting onions under my scarf. But they said that's mainly to try to overcome the tear gas. So when you are tear gas, the onion is gonna, and the vinegar also. Vinegar is also gonna be effective in terms of, overcoming the tear gas. Never ever carry an ID card with you, because the ID card will make it easy for them to arrest you and to know who you are, and so on and so forth. So these very small, nitty-gritty, details and advice in terms of what to do and what not to do on a day-to-day basis in the heart of Tahrir Square, right? Coming from the Tunisian protesters and activists, right, who are sending their own knowledge to their Egyptian counterparts and giving them advice. Spray the police cars and the military cars with, dark paint, so that in order to make it harder for them to attack you when you are protesting. These kinds of very logistical, small details were being, exchanged between the people in the diaspora or protesters from other countries and their counterparts in other countries in the region. There was also a very important role in terms of the material and moral support that was coming to some of the protesters from their counterparts in the diaspora. The Syrian opposition is a case in point. We have a very strong Syrian opposition abroad that has been trying to support the protesters and activists inside Syria in so many ways. Trying to provide them with moral support, but also material support, helping the refugees, helping women who are victims of rape or assault, creating centers, even groups online to try to, collect money and to fundraise for these victims and refugees and people who were actually affected negatively by what's going on in Syria. So there are so many examples of material, moral, logistical, financial support, as well as the exchange of useful information from the protesters and activists in the diaspora to those inside the respective countries, which is why we need to study them further and to focus more on their role in our upcoming research. As for GCC countries, I think they were not just centered in GCC countries, there were also many of them in Turkey, in many other parts of the region, and even abroad in Western countries as well, right? So I think that we have to look at it in a more global, international perspective. I don't think that it's only limited to the GCC countries. And the GCC countries, by the way, despite some of the conservatism, there is also the highest level of using social media in this region. The country that has the highest number of tweeters, those who use Twitter, which country in the world do you think it is? Who said Saudi Arabia? Absolutely. Thank you, both of you. You're going to win a prize today. Congratulations. Noha and Debra and Debbie, winners today. Saudi Arabia, who would have thought, right? When I say the country that has the largest number of tweeters, people will think the USA, right? Canada, Britain. Actually, it's Saudi Arabia. And one thing I did not mention in my presentation today, I should have mentioned it, is that 70% of the population in the Arab region are young people under the age of 30 and 35. What does that mean? It means that you have much more potential for socio-political transformation, for the use of social media and cyber activism, because these young people, as we all know, are very technologically savvy. They are on their own apps and their own, mobile phones 24/7. Those of you who have kids who are teenagers, like myself, you know that, right? They're always on the social media and literally, they will never even look at you. They're on it 24/7. Did you do the homework? Sure. They don't even raise their head to look at you. What does that mean? It means that there is a very big potential for these young people who constitute 70% of the population in this region and who are very technologically savvy in terms of enacting socio-political transformation and change using these tools, even in some of the more conservative countries like GCC countries, which have the highest rates of using social media and new media.
Okay, and then this gentleman here.
Hello. Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation.
Where are you, sir? Oh, here. Okay, thank you. I was just Okay.
No.
Okay, now.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. Yes. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Saha.
Thank you.
But I have two comments to make. One is about Mursi, and the second one about the free press. Mursi was not the candidate of the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood. He was a last-minute substitute. He spent a long time in America, and his charisma is questionable, and he's not very savvy in politics. So he paid a price. He couldn't deliver. Some say it's too short a period for him to deliver. But I said he has no connection with the political scenario in Egypt at all. Number two, free and open press or media, free media is vital and crucial for democracy to work. But can you enlighten me how many percent in Egypt are illiterate and how many percent are literate? And this is a very big problem in the Middle East. It differs from one country to the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, about Morsi, that's not exactly our topic today, but very briefly, of course, he was not a very charismatic leader, and he was not, in my opinion, the best person to rule Egypt. And I'm not a fan of Morsi or a fan of the Brotherhood. This is not the case at all. I'm just not particularly excited about the idea of having him ousted through military, what should I say? Fill in the blanks. Through military, fill in the blanks. Okay? I don't want to upset my friend here, Ms. Fatma. She just liked my talk, so I don't want to lose her as a friend. We're going to have coffee together, okay? Later on. So basically, I'm not happy about this fill in the blanks, but that does not mean I'm necessarily a fan of Morsi. He had many shortcomings. He was not a charismatic leader. And the Brotherhood really as an institution is not a democratic institution inside itself. And if you lose something, you cannot give it. You know, we have this saying in Arabic, فاقد الشيء لا يعطيه. I don't know how many of you speak Arabic, but I'll translate it. If you lose something or you lack something, you cannot give it. And it did not really have its own well-entrenched internal, democratic mechanisms, which means it cannot really institute or create a democratic institution in the country because it does not have it within its own ranks. And I can go on and on to talk about the shortcomings of the Brotherhood as an organization or as a group, as well as the shortcomings of Morsi. But we cannot ignore and turn a blind eye to the fact that for the very first time, Egyptians went out to the polls and they ousted, they really cast a ballot in the voting polls. That's something we have not seen in Egypt for a long time. Egyptians were very apathetic in terms of political participation. They did not bother to go to the polls and to vote. They felt that the outcome is going to be known in every case. So why should I bother to go to the poll and stand in a long queue in the heat to cast the ballot when I know in advance the outcome of the elections? So basically, what happened was the first time that we have seen the process of a democratically elected president. Although you can also say that is democracy only about the casting of a ballot? Is democracy only about the voting mechanism? That's something else we need to talk about or discuss. It's not the topic of our discussion today, but in general, we can also challenge the whole notion of democracy and democratization and what it means, and that it's much more than just casting a ballot in the elections or voting. But we cannot underestimate that Egyptians did vote and did have a say. That was an important point in Egypt's modern history, and therefore it needs to be studied. And like you said, also some people will say he was only in power for 1 year, and with a country like Egypt, with all its challenges, economic, political, and social challenges, even if you bring one of the messengers of God, he cannot change things in 1 year. It is just not possible, right? It's just not possible. So that's why I think that would have been better for everyone if he was given his, 4 years in power, and then when he does not perform, and I think he would not have performed well, then you can get rid of him also through the elections and through voting. The second part of your question about the role of social media, can you remind me the second part of your question? But I want to know how to break down the literacy and yes, that's a very important point, and I think I touched upon this briefly when I talked about the digital divide. Because we do have a high illiteracy rate in Egypt, unfortunately, almost 45%, which is shameful because a country like Egypt taught the whole world the whole process of writing. The word paper comes from the word papyrus. So the whole process of writing even came out of Egypt, right? Which is really a shame. So when I tell my students this 45% illiteracy rate, I'm very ashamed of that. But it's a reality. And it's not just about illiteracy. You also have infrastructural constraints and barriers. You have a high poverty rate. You have a lot of constraints technically and so on. However, having said all of that, you would be very, I think, astonished to know that even in some of the remote small villages in Egypt, I was doing research there as part of my own ethnographic work. I go to the Egyptian villages. I do research on family planning and literacy and health awareness before I got caught up in the Arab Spring euphoria. That was the kind of work I was doing for many years. You would go to some of these small villages and small towns, and you will be surprised. You will see a woman who is illiterate. She does not read and write, yet she is watching her favorite religious preacher online. How does that happen? She asks her own daughter or son or grandchild before they go to work or before they go to school, can you please, push this particular button for me so I can watch my favorite religious preacher online? Very interesting. What does that tell us? It tells us that these new media and social media are infiltrating even some of the remote rural areas that have all of these infrastructural barriers and constraints, and that have things like high illiteracy rate, poverty, or even technological and infrastructural constraints. This also requires that we as researchers look at the digital divide between the technologically haves and have-nots, the rural and urban areas, the more advantaged and less advantaged areas, the more educated, the less educated. But we should also address a process called the secondary users of new media and social media. Just like these women in the village who are relying on their children or grandchildren, can you please switch the button for me before you go to work? Now she can watch her own favorite content on the internet, even though she herself is not educated or not technologically savvy. So we as researchers have to also study the digital divide. We have to study areas outside of the capitals. We have to look at these secondary users of social media and new media and the impact they can have as well moving forward.
Okay, well, we have about another 5 minutes, and I have to have my little say, so I will have my little say.
You have to give the
now.
director the platform.
I found this very fascinating. There are a couple of things which are more comments. One question. First of all, the question, I remember at the time there were all sorts of links to orange movements in Georgia and so on, but I haven't heard very much about that since. The other protest movements, the very end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s in the Caucasus, in parts of Eastern Europe and so on. And that people were sort of circulating from all these movements to these various different places. I think my question is, is this in fact the case, and what kind of influence did it have? As far as Syria is concerned, I think, the movement in Syria starts in Daraa, which, I suppose is certainly is a small town, Daraa and Idlib. And also, that's one thing. Secondly, Salwa Ismail at SOAS has done very, very interesting work in the poor suburbs of Cairo, the poor suburbs of Damascus, which are not populated by university-educated people, and what they are concerned about are things like police brutality and so forth. And she's written about this. I can't remember the title of it, but it's all extremely interesting. And so, she's Egyptian, of course, and she has done all this work, and I found this really very fascinating. And there's an article by Linders and Heidemann called something about the early risers in Syria. In other words, that people who went out onto the streets first in Daraa, Idlib, and so on. And my last sort of comment is, it seems to me that if you don't have the army and the deep state on your side, no permanent change is going to take place.
Mm-hmm. These are three very important points. Every one of them deserves a lecture all by itself.
Well,
I can just
I'd rather do the last question.
I can just comment very quickly or very briefly. I don't know if I'll do justice in these brief comments, but for the very first important point, I think that there has been what can be described as a two-way flow of information, communication, and influence between the West and the Arab world in a very interesting way, that we have not really seen or witnessed before. Meaning that indeed some of the revolts and protests that you have mentioned may have very well had an impact on the so-called Arab Spring or Arab Awakening movements and the use of social media and new media in this region. But also, for the very first time, we have seen a process in reverse, a two-way process. What does that mean? It means that other capitals in the world, including in the Western world, and even in Israel, were influenced by what was going on in the heart of Tahrir Square and many parts of the Arab region. For the very first time, we have seen this as not a one-way flow whereby the Arab population is learning from the experiences of the West, but we have seen a process in the other direction, meaning we have seen the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Philly, Occupy other parts of the US and other capitals that have really modeled after the form of protest that was going on inside some of the capitals in the Arab region, including Cairo and other cities. And in Tel Aviv in Israel, we have seen protesters who are occupying some of the areas in Tel Aviv and even chanting slogans in a way, in a rhythm which is very similar to what has been going on in these Arab capitals. So it will be very interesting to look at the two-way interaction or the two-way flow of information and communication and the influence in reverse, meaning not just the influence of protesters in the West who may have impacted these Arab Spring protesters, but also the other way around, how the Arab Spring protests had a snowballing or ripple effect on other regions and other parts of the world, including the US and Israel and other countries. The second point you mentioned about doing research in urban areas, I'm glad you mentioned the researcher and her work, but we need to see more of that, especially now, 4 years after the eruption of the Arab Spring, what was going on and what is going on inside these rural areas. I was approached by the Middle East Institute in Washington to actually write a study about the ruralization of the revolution, meaning how are the rural areas in many of these so-called post-Arab Spring countries really undergoing their own process of transformation, and what role are they playing in terms of changing the political and social and communication landscapes in these countries. Unfortunately, I did not have the time to write this paper yet, but I would very much like to devote time to write it, because these places are not dormant. They're not asleep. They do have their own forms of activism as well. It is just that we did not focus the spotlight on them sufficiently. We need to do more of that. And as I said, take a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, they have their own support bases and popular bases in some of the villages and small towns and so on. These people, we need to study this phenomena and to understand what kind of tools and mechanisms and communication platforms are they using and why and how. So we need to do more of that, but thank you for mentioning the researcher. And the last point you mentioned was?
Well, I think that if you don't have the army and the deep state on your side, then
so here is the thing. It's a very, very important point, and thank you for mentioning that. I think I talked about civil society and civic engagement, right? And we need to address these processes, and we cannot take them at face value or take them for granted, because as I said earlier, ousting a dictator from office is easy, but deciding what to do next is very difficult and very tough, and that's where the real challenge is. Right? It's not enough to just say, okay, I don't like this dictator, let's get rid of him. Okay, that's fine. Then what do you do next? If you don't have a clear strategy and a clear agenda of the next steps that you really want to enact, you're going to end up in some kind of chaos, right? You might create even more harm than good, more danger than benefit. So you need to have a well-entrenched, comprehensive process of socio-political transformation and change that encompasses every aspect of life, whether it's political, economic, social, or in terms of the media and communication arena. If you just have one piece but not the other pieces in place, then you are really opening the doors of possible chaos and even relapsing into a form of dictatorship or a form of complete anarchy, which is very dangerous for any country and for any society. That's why you need to have this comprehensive, total change in all of these institutions, which I'm afraid has not been the case in many of the so-called post-Arab Spring countries. We still need to see well-entrenched institutions, opposition parties, and active civil society, and this has not been the case so far.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.